There are few foods which are amazing to eat, yet so utterly useless to us as humans. However, popcorn is one of those foods. Ridiculously tempting. The smell, I don't know if you can smell it. The smell, the look, the little round balls of fat and fibre coated in large amounts of butter substitutes and plenty of salt. What good is popcorn without butter and salt? When I was growing up, every now and again my mother would see packets of popping corn and she would buy it. I don't remember how very available it was, but when she found it, she would bring it home and my dad would make popcorn on a Saturday night. We'd sit in the living room with the Saturday night movie on TV and have popcorn. Even when my dad got older, we'd go to a fete and he'd ask for the popcorn. My dad was born and raised in Minnesota, and popcorn was a way of life to them. I don't remember my school friends in Australia eating hot popcorn. They tended to eat that coloured, dyed, cold stuff from a plastic bag. As children, we would stand near the stove while my dad jiggled the pan while the kernels popped. Every now and again he'd open the lid and one would pop out and we'd all chase it and laugh. He'd coat it with lots of butter and plenty of salt. It was salty enough to make the insides of your cheeks pucker. Popcorn just doesn't taste right without butter and salt. Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth. You add flavour. You enhance what God is doing when you work with God. But if you lose that flavour, then what good are you?" Party, a dinner table for visitors or a special event, I usually put a candle on the table. The flame on the candle flickers and it dances. It throws a very different light. I can turn off the harsh overhead lights and allow the subtle lights of the candles to dance across the table and twinkle in people's eyes. It creates an intimate and relaxed dinner atmosphere. I often play music in the background. It's not just the food, it's the atmosphere. The candlelight brings a softness and a warmth to the meal. But candlelight is fickle. Too much breeze and the candle burns quickly and it smokes. Too little air and the light falters. And eventually it will go out. I didn't time that. Jesus said to his disciples, "You are the light of the world. You help bring God's light into the dark places. What good are you if you hide your light?" Today's readings from Matthew is one where these very words are part of our everyday language. We will speak of a person as someone who is the salt of the earth, someone who is grounded and generous. someone who is known and authentic and trusted. We will speak of a person not hiding their light under a bushel as someone who's out there, full of personality and enthusiasm, someone with great confidence. Jesus says, you are salt. You are light. The image, while important, I don't believe is the key part of this reading. They're not the halting or drawing you up moment. The significant part of the reading is the questions. Who hides their light under a bushel? What good is salt if it loses its saltiness? This is the point of today's lesson. How often do we hide our light or don't add something good to a situation? Isaiah is told by God to go out and shout this message to God's people, his people who wonder why God is ignoring their pleas for help. And God says, you stumble around and think you're holy for an hour on the Sabbath, and then you cheat your neighbours, you hold back from the poor, you allow those who are at the wrong end of a situation to have their situation made worse, and then you ask, why am I ignoring you? You do nothing to help. You stand in the way of those who do by telling them that they're breaking the Sabbath or one of Moses' laws, and then you cry out as though I've ignored you. In verse 4, it says this, your fasting ends with quarrelling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do that way and expect your voice to be heard on high. In reality, the Jews were expected to only fast on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. However, fasting was a practice used to demonstrate or promote piety. Isaiah was to shout out, dare I say, trumpet out to God's people. Piety is not a competition. It's not about how hungry you are or sleep deprived you are, but rather your personal humility and attitude, coming to God in that state of humility for the one day of the year, so God has the opportunity to be truly present with you, his people who come in earnest, yearning contrition. By the time of Jesus, and these rules we're talking many centuries before Jesus, but by the time of Jesus, the Pharisees fasted 2 days a week, Mondays and Thursdays. Some would also dirty their faces to show that they were fasting. While Jesus criticised the public display of and declaration of fasting, he didn't criticise the practice itself. He did ask, what good is salt if it loses its saltiness? It's only worth being thrown out onto the road to be trampled. As Isaiah continues, God asks, is not the kind of fasting I've shown you to take the time to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share food with the hungry and provide shelter for the poor wanderer? When you see the naked, clothe him, and do not turn away from your own flesh and blood. The readings from Isaiah and Matthew are taken from the lectionary, which is due to be read this week. This will be read in all churches that use the Revised Common Lectionary. If you heard the lectionary readings from last week, you would have heard two very familiar readings. Micah 6, verses 1 to 8, what does God require of you? And Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12, the Sermon on the Mount. 750 years before Jesus, Micah tells the people of Israel, what the Lord requires of you, Israel, is that Israel will seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. His contemporary, Isaiah, is shouting the same thing. When you loose the chains of injustice, when you untie the cords of the yoke and break the yoke, when you see the naked and clothe them, when you share your food and offer shelter, then your light will break forth from the dawn and your healing will appear quickly. Your righteousness will go before you and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. What a great image. God's righteousness shining through his people and behind them, protecting them, is the glory of the Lord. What good is salt if it loses its saltiness? Why should I put light under a basket? How often do we see injustice and say or do nothing? How often do we change the channel or stop listening to the cries of the lost and the forsaken? How often do we, both as a society and individuals, beat our chests about what should be done and in reality do nothing ourselves? Confession time now. I can do nothing more than stand here and admit. That's what I do. I beat my chest and talk about how things drive me crazy and someone should do something about it, but please not me because I'm really busy at the moment. I'm a great one for buying food, and then when it goes mouldy or grows extra little bits, I just throw it out. I'm the first one to admit that I really only have time for God on Tuesday mornings between 9:30 and 11 because after that I've got plenty of other things to do. Am I really too busy for God? I hear Jesus saying, what good are you to me if, as salt, you have lost your willingness to add flavour to my purpose? I hear Jesus saying, do you really put your light under a basket so no one can see me shining through you? Now don't get me wrong here. I feel God is always present with me. These readings are not about him. These readings are about me, about us, about how we come to understand how God wants us to be towards him and towards each other. Not in exaggerated religiosity, but in the way we respond to each other with grace and in kindness. Not in bragging rights for piety, but in humility, in reverence, and with hearts that yearn. Micah last week and Isaiah this week seem to be sending a loud and very clear message. Dare I say they're shouting a message from God. It's about how you are and what you do for and with me that is important to me. Because later in the reading in verse 10 it says this, if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become as noonday. The Lord will always be with you. Jesus says, instead, put your light on its stand so it gives light to all. And in the same way, let your light shine before all people, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. not praise me, but my Father in heaven. I'm not one for New Year's resolutions. Another confession. I used to, and they'd last, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks. Then I'd spend the rest of the year beating myself up about how I can't even live out my own New Year's resolutions. This year, however, I realised I needed to live a little differently. I need to tread a little more lightly on the planet. And I need a year to learn how to do that. Recycle, reuse, reduce. Not only for my benefit, but for the planet's benefit. I think Isaiah and Matthew today are both offering us a spiritual New Year's resolution, an opportunity to learn how to live more closely attuned to what God requires from me, from us, from the church, from the community, and from the world. If we all sought justice or loosed the chains of injustice, if we all loved mercy or offered the wanderer shelter, clothed the naked and fed the hungry, if we all walked humbly with God, developed hearts which yearn for God's grace, peace and joy, how different would our church be? How different our community? How different the world? Different enough to see that people would notice, different enough that others would see and ask, what makes them different? Different enough that people would come to understand what God is doing through his people. Jesus says, you are salt, you are light. And Isaiah says, and the Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in this sun-scorched land and strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose water never fails. For each of us, the taste of salt and the light shining will be different. For each of us, there is a role to play in God's amazing plan of salvation. For each of us, the message from Isaiah or Micah or Matthew will touch our hearts differently. The questions remain. What do we need to do? How are we salt and light to this world in this place? May God add his blessing to these words. Amen. Roddy Hamilton is another composer of prayers and reflections, and I've found this one. It's inspired by today's Matthew reading, but it's a different image of salt because Roddy lives in the Northern Hemisphere and he lives in a very snowy place. So his salt image is about melting the frozenness of God's people. Of course, in snowbound areas, salt is used after the snowplows to melt the ice and to provide some traction on the road for cars and trucks to keep them safe. This is his reflection on salt. Salt, to melt away the frozenness of God's people, to take away what has been dulled and to add flavour once more, of tasting suffering in the breadcrumbs as well as in the heavenly banquet, of tasting creation in a bite of an apple and the pain of it all, of tasting the whole story of faith in a single glass of water, bringing out the life, the fullness, the richness of what lies hidden, and letting the potential change us, enthuse us, delight us. Salt, melting away what has been frozen and setting free the fullness that energises our expectations once more.